بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Assalamu alaikum. I greet you in greetings of peace. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. I give thanks, including thanks for all of you. Some of you have returned from last week. Some of you may be new this week. But I am anxious to share with you what I have, and I'd like to begin by a brief review to emphasize and let you compare what you think are the important points of last week and what you may or may not remember. I'd like to begin, first of all, by saying that this course originates or was inspired especially by the death of George Floyd. And his death provoked a worldwide re-examination, a worldwide look at people's situation and justice or injustice in almost every nation of the world, regardless of their nationality or their race. So justice is an idea and a concept that is important to all human beings. Say the names. We know this is part of the death of George Floyd because he is what triggered this, but we know it was based on a long history, beginning in recent times only with our brothers and sisters like Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. But George Floyd provoked an international response. And unfortunately, that response continues because some of the injustice also continues. I'd like to review now the points from our last discussion and the slides that go with them before extending the answer to a very good question that was submitted at the end of our last week's discussion. So from pre-Mayflower to post-pandemic. So we're talking about 2020, but we're talking about the lead up, not only from 1619 and 1620, but all the way back to 1492, when Christopher Columbus was emblematic of a new world order, beginning in the Iberian Peninsula with Spain and the monarchs of Spain that had just in that same year conquered the Muslims and expelled the Jews and came up with the first grammar of the Spanish language. Next slide, please. End of la convivencia. There were three religious traditions living together for nearly 800 years: the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. Sepharad, Iberia, and Al-Andalus. Next slide, please. Muslims defeated, Jews expelled, and Nebriha's new grammar. We'll come back to that because this very point relates to the question that was asked, and that is how empire, how colonialism, how this era affects and language, how it affects us even today. A change in the world order that was economic, political, social, cultural, and linguistic. The rise of European empires, this is the impact. All these languages and so forth. Again, we have two slides in a row that relate to this question. Hope to delve just a little bit deeper into how language today and its changes affect us. What is chattel slavery? This is one of the biggest points to understand as we go forward, to distinguish between slavery as a general term and chattel slavery. Concept of slavery new concept of race, and a new definition of human being. This what is ushered in when you add the word chattel to slavery. Chattel rhymes with cattle, and sometimes we think of this is more how people, human beings, were treated as animals like cattle when chattel slavery came in. So this is the general definition of slavery, and not new to us, but still no one wants to be in a position of working without pay or subject to mistreatment or having virtually no power or very little generally in their own household, in their own society. They have no rights in their household and society, perhaps. Next, please. Chattel slavery, a person who was owned forever. This is credited with the type of slavery that came in after 1492. It was used by the Portuguese and the Spanish, but especially the English in North America, in the United States in particular. So chattel slavery, you are owned and all your future generations are owned. Your labor, your livelihood, all goes for the person who has purchased you, a human being. So significance and legacy of chattel slavery in Europe and the United States produced vast fortunes for individuals, financed the Industrial Revolution and the resulting global economic dominance of the Western nations, created the immense wealth gap that today separates Americans of European descent and Americans of enslaved African descent. And one footnote on this slide, I may not have pointed out last time that a former president of the nation of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, Eric Williams, wrote a doctoral dissertation called Capitalism and Slavery in the late 1940s. And that was published as a book in about 1949 or 1950. And this argued the case of how the slavery, the chattel slavery in the Americas financed the Industrial Revolution and was one of the most prolific sources of wealth that the world has ever seen. Well, that's 16 generations or more of free labor. So that is part of this legacy that we see in the United States, the wealth gap, which science, racial science, economic science is elaborating within the last several years in particular, as part of the reasons why there is a separation and a disenfranchisement and a disadvantage for people of African descent, especially in the United States and other places in the Americas. So this is another big point from last week. 3 rebellions, 17th century Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. This is early 1600s when these rebellions took place, and virtually the end of that same century, because one of them lasted for 100 years. In Yanga of Mexico, I got a chance to see Yanga. There is a life-sized statue here of Yanga, who was the African guerrilla leader and statesman, escaped slave, who led other escaped slaves for several years in a fight against the Spanish, attacking and then fleeing on the Royal Road, El Camino Real, between Veracruz and Mexico City, where everyone had to send goods coming from Spain or return from Mexico City. They had to go on this road from the center of Mexico to the coast. And he negotiated after guerrilla warfare and got the peace. I got a chance to see a replica of the document at the museum in Mexico, and I got a chance to see the larger than life-size metal statue depicting the freedom fighter and statesman negotiator with a sword or machete in his hand. So then we have Palenque de San Basilio of Colombia. This, again, Bencos de Villajó freed his community, negotiated, got a signed charter. I got a chance to visit this community. And there is a bust replica of this daring leader who, with a broken chain in each hand, having broken the chains of slavery for his people in that area with a lot of help. And finally, in Palmares of Brazil, this is the only one of the three which has very little remnant. It had to be razed to the ground because it became so powerful. Again, through warfare, not just guerrilla warfare, it was a community that became so large and so powerful that the Portuguese decided it must be destroyed. The Dutch controlled, between the years that the Portuguese had it and the years that the Portuguese won it back, about 25 years, the Dutch also were plagued by Palmares. Slaves or enslaved people would escape and go to Palmares, where they found safe haven, and they trained to defend themselves. They grew their own food. They developed their own government based on a Central African example or structure, pattern of government. It was a multicultural community. That is, there were indigenous peoples, there were Portuguese-speaking peoples, and most of all, there were African, primarily and predominantly African peoples living there, speaking many different African languages. Portuguese might have been their lingua franca to let all be able to communicate with each other. But this was a multicultural, ethnic example of an environment against colonial oppression. And so that's significant because most of us don't know about any of these communities and the fact that they were the first to achieve freedom from the European powers that we know in the Americas and that achieved great empires. So what is the most important part, the legacy? Let's look at the next slide, if we may. Let's look at the next slide to see if we have some last reminders about this legacy. It may be that the greatest legacy is the fact that we have three outstanding examples of nation states or communities that rose up and showed through military might, through diplomatic astuteness, intellectual ability, and a knowledge of their history, that they were able to achieve this freedom. So we have examples that are hard to argue against, that people of African descent and Africans themselves who were brought as enslaved people, prisoners of war, couldn't achieve great things. In fact, almost 200 years before the Enlightenment, which is credited with the revolutions that we're going to look at, occurred in microcosm, so to speak, but very significantly. Why? Because they defeated the world's greatest empires of their time, and long before the people at large, and especially the Europeans, like in the United States, like in all of Latin America, were leading rebellion, leading revolution against the European crown. So let's look at, we can see the reminder. We're going to go into more detail in a few moments about the Age of Enlightenment and the four revolutions. But someone asked a question before. And a viewer, Chantel Dawn, what role does language continue to play in enslavement, remnants, or colonialism or neo-colonialism of Americas and Africa? Well, I'd like to begin first, referring back to the slide. Antonio Nebrija presented his grammar, the very first grammar of the Spanish language, to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand in 1492. And when the Queen had a little bit of a quizzical expression on her face, or the King also, I imagine. So the story goes. This is a little bit outside of the history, but she posed the question, basically, why? And he said, Your Majesty, language is a tool of empire. And so she quickly realized what he was saying, that language will help us rule. Language begins to help us communicate with those we conquer, and those we conquer who may speak different languages among themselves will all have a lingua franca, or the same language to communicate in. More importantly, it allows, in that kind of a situation, the conqueror or colonizing power to shape the concepts and the thoughts of the people they conquer by teaching them a new language, and often requiring that that be the language that they use and communicate in. And so all of the concepts of government and culture and so forth begin to, little by little, sometimes all at once, replace the language that they used for their own self-government, their own culture. Not that it disappeared. Some of those languages are still spoken by hundreds of thousands. The indigenous languages now I'm referring to in the Americas are still spoken by hundreds of thousands or even millions of people in Peru and Mexico in particular. But the ruling power has its own language. I saw a program that some of you may have seen over this weekend, in fact, yesterday, about the commemoration of the Ma'afa, or the remembrance of the Middle Passage, the millions of Africans who were brought during the Middle Passage from the continent of Africa to the continents of the so-called New World, which is North America, South America, and also the Caribbean and Central America. It is estimated that up to 30% survived, but many did not. So it's estimated that anywhere from 10 million to 100 million people were taken. So this is an opportunity to commemorate. And so you will find these commemorations all over the country, usually in June. And so many of the commentators, some were academics, professors, such as myself, some were activists, some were just, again, everyday people who are very interested in where they come from and what our history has been. And so one of the people observed that knowing languages, especially the languages that served the European colonizers, is one key to unlocking our own history, because there are so many documents today preserved in not only English, but in Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, and French, and especially Spanish and Portuguese, because they were here on this continent and have records of their activities long before the English arrived. So language can be a key, even though it can be a tool of colonizing and ruling. It can be a key to unlock our history as descendants of Africa. So that's an important point for us to remember as we try to learn languages. An example today, even on the continent of Europe and in Spain, that shows language can be used as a tool of rulership and control, is the fact that all languages except the language we know as Spanish were outlawed during most of the 20th century under Francisco Franco. Only in 1975, when King Juan Carlos came in, were those languages restored. That is, the right to speak and write and use those languages and even be educated in those languages. There were at least 3 other major languages, Basque language and Gallego or Galician language, let's see, well, 7 altogether and 4 that are still very much in use. And so, again, it shows people's culture. We know Spanish language as Spanish, and that's all we know. But Castellano was the regional name until it began to go over to the Americas and have one name to represent the country. There is another important effect of language. Not knowing that language was part of our identity, our cultural and spiritual identity that was robbed from us. And we mentioned last time 2 books that are going to be in dialogue, so to speak, to help inform the course. And one of those books is The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. And one of the things that he points out when he talks about education is how the education that we as Afro descendants was not provided, often still is not provided in the schools. And so he pointed out in regard to language, he said, in the study of language, in school, pupils were made to scoff at the Negro dialect as some peculiar possession of the Negro, which they should despise, rather than directed to study the background of this language as a broken down African tongue. In short, to understand their own linguistic history, which is certainly more important for them than the study of French phonetics or historical Spanish grammar. To the African language as such, no attention was given, except in the case of the preparation of traders, missionaries, public functionaries to exploit the natives. So this, written back in 1933, saw a great change in the field of linguistics, because now you have Black or African descended linguists who are giving us just this kind of a background. There's a linguist called John McWhorter who teaches at Columbia University, who has written extensively about Black English and other mixed languages. He says such mixed languages are typically seen as lesser versions of other ones. Jamaican as bad English, for example, judgment leveled also against Black English in America. Urban Nigerians, aside from indigenous languages, speak a Creole English descended from Jamaican and Gullah, which we know from South Carolina, via a transportation of slaves back to Sierra Leone in Africa after the Revolutionary War. That's here in the United States. That is, a person from Kingston and a person from Lagos, Nigeria, Kingston, Jamaica, could converse in a language that to most of us would be barely comprehensible beyond the occasional recognizable word. A speaker of this language will typically dismiss it as broken English, when its grammatical description, in fact, runs hundreds of pages. And learning to speak this so-called broken language would be a matter of lessons, practice, endless mistakes, and never truly sounding native, just as with any other language. So this might be incredible to us, especially those of us who grew up hearing Black English, whether in our families or all around us in our neighborhoods or anywhere we went among other African descended peoples, other Black peoples in this country or in the Caribbean and in Africa, as we see here. But look at it from another side. We have to, like the title of a book written by Michael Wolff called Taking Back Islam. Taking Back Islam was about taking back our faith that began to be taken away from us and redefined, especially after 9/11, 2001. And so Muslims stood up and said, no, we're going to be the definers of our own faith based on our scriptures in Quran and Hadith and Sirah, the customs and traditions of the Prophet and the life of our Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him. So like fashion, we have the opportunity now to take back, if we can't take back our own languages that our ancestors spoke, most of us never have spoken them, certainly growing up in the home as they were learned originally as first languages. But we can take back the concepts and the culture that governed our way of life if we learn this history from each other, from our records, and so forth. So we have, again, we talked about Quran before. Iqra, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq, خلق الإنسان من علق. اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. Read or proclaim in the name of your Lord. This was the first revelation to our prophet, and it emphasized to us not only the revelation itself and what we were going to be taught, but a new spiritual identity that began to be revealed to our prophet, peace be upon him. And that's where we go as our primary source for our spiritual identity. But we know that we also have traditions, as we spoke about last time, that is, go as far as China, even to the ends of the earth for knowledge, if that's how far you have to go. We have individual responsibility in Surah Luqman, in 31:28, we know that not except as an individual soul will we be resurrected. And translator Yusuf Ali explains this, that individual responsibility is something that rises up not only as the masses, where our God knows everything that happens, but even to the individual and the level of individual responsibility is part of that relationship also. So this is part of how we get back our spiritual identity, our cultural identity, and our identity that was robbed from us is through language. So we have to be mindful of this. We have to look at language. It's not only a tool of empire, it's a tool for us to access our history, but we always have to be mindful of our language. We know that we have the greatest access to our religion through Arabic language because that was the language it was revealed in. So we may have to look at new terms. The last point on this answer to this question, this celebration, the Ma'afa, or commemoration, I should say, that is honoring and commemorating all those who lost their lives on the passage, the Middle Passage from West Africa to these shores in the Americas. It's been called the Ma'afa because this is a Kiswahili word or Swahili word in English that means a great tragedy. It means an occurrence, terrible occurrence, a kind of a genocide in this case. And so many felt it was more appropriate to refer to it, and not just as the Middle Passage, but to show that it was a horrific occasion and a continuing history, not only crossing the Atlantic, but all of the effects thereafter with enslavement among transplanted Africans forcibly brought here. But there was conversation about this. Another scholar and activist, Ron Karenga, said, no, we shouldn't use Ma'afa. We should use Black Holocaust or African Holocaust. People know from the history of the Jews what the Holocaust was in Germany, the genocide of the Jews, and all of the horrific things that went with that. And this is our Holocaust. Others disagreed and said no. So there's discussion on it, but it revolves around the use of language. You always want to give background on your terms and not just use a term indiscriminately, it's pointing out. Even a term like transatlantic slave trade. Scholar Sylviane Diouf, who wrote the book Servants of Allah about enslaved Africans in the Americas, objected to the term transatlantic slave trade. She said, this is a word that sounds like it's a mere commercial venture with maybe some unfortunate consequences or blowback, so to speak. That's to be expected. Businesses don't always do so well, don't always succeed as well as they'd like. No, you are disguising or hiding when you use a term like transatlantic slave trade, as if trade is what's going on, as if you can trade in human beings, instead of calling it a mass murder characterized by intense violence and a moral atrocity. So again, this is questioning. Just like we talked about in looking at sources, how do we discover the truth? How do we get the background that's necessary for us to move forward? Without the background, we are going to be hampered in our efforts. So when we look at different points of view, as these scholars are, they're asking questions. They're holding each other as well as people who may have been on the oppressive side of things accountable in how we express ourselves. So these are examples of how language very much affects us today and continues to. So language can be a tool. It can work for you or it can work against you. But realize Imam W.D. Muhammad also talked about doing things with words, spoken word, and the importance of selecting the words you use. So even in the old Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad, no nicknames. Muslims don't like nicknames because they may be very negative. We hold each other accountable for the language we use. So I thank you, Sister Chattel, for your question. I'd like to move on now to the discussion that we have for today. If we have a chance, we'll come back to some of these topics because they really characterize our whole course and provide us with context and focus for what we're trying to do. Age of Enlightenment, 4 revolutions. This is the prelude. This second discussion is the prelude for one of the most important that we'll have. I guess that's fittingly in the middle next week. And that is the documents, the Declaration of Independence, and the U.S. Constitution. We are part, I say, meaning the United States of America, are part of the four revolutions, one of the four revolutions, and all were influenced, stimulated, affected, and in part brought about, so historians tell us, by the Age of Enlightenment. So let's proceed. So the Age of Enlightenment, if you hear the names John Locke, Sir Isaac Newton, Jacques Rousseau, and Benjamin Franklin, or Thomas Paine, or Thomas Jefferson, you may recognize some of the names in that list, at least. You may recognize all of them, or you may recognize none. But they are all principal players, writers, speakers, thinkers, thought leaders in what came to be known as the Age of Enlightenment. In French and Spanish especially, it's called El Siglo de las Luces, the Century of Lights. And not because there were physical lights like a Christmas tree, but this is because the human mind is supposed to be becoming more enlightened because of the ideas being introduced, some for the first time. Dangerous ideas. Why? Because they were against the authority of kings, the divine right of kings, and introducing ideas like people have a right to self-determination. So what are the main ideas and ideals of the Enlightenment that you think helped fuel the American Revolution? So some of you may recognize the name Thomas Paine, who was one of the major influencers and collaborators to a degree with Thomas Jefferson, although he was born in England and came over here as an adult, but who was fired up by many of these ideas in the Enlightenment. Very unique history. He wrote Common Sense. More about that later. Which of these ideas or ideals, if any, are still relevant to today's struggle for social justice? So that's the main point. This is not only history. Everything we talk about in history, we're trying to mine, we're trying to translate and see what is there of value that helps us reclaim from our past material, information that will help us create a better future. Next slide, please. Four revolutions that rocked the world. American Revolution was actually first among the four, 1775 to 1783. Who knew? Who remembered that we had 8 years of warfare? That's longer than the U.S. Civil War, which came later. Maybe no less important, however, for this country, but that's a long time. That's a long fighting period. And we know people of African descent were involved. French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. You may have heard the phrase, off with their heads. The guillotine got more use then than ever. 1789 to 1799. Those wars back in those days, they were as long as many wars are now, sometimes longer, sometimes a little shorter, but that's a long time to be at war, especially within one country. Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. That's over a decade. The Haitian Revolution. This was one of the only ones, the only one of these four, which was took a direct legacy from the three rebellions we heard about last week. That is, this was the only completely successful, okay, we have to put quotes around everything, but this was a successful revolution by escaped slaves on the Caribbean island of Haiti, which was the richest colony of the richest in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean was the richest area ever, financed the Industrial Revolution and numerous individual fortunes, and Haiti producing sugarcane. There was a great sweet tooth in Europe at that time. And we had a revolution that changed the government completely. Not even Napoleon's troops, who tried to come back in 1801 or so, could defeat the armies of Buchmann and Toussaint Louverture and the other brave leaders and fighters among the Haitian people, the Africans and descendants of Africans there. So this is another something for us to keep in mind. And this will come back later. We know now that Haiti is one of the poorest, if not the poorest country in the world and in the Americas. Why is that when they were the first to achieve independence in Latin America? Wars for independence in Latin America, 1808 to 1826. These are many different countries nowadays. All of Mexico and Central America and all of South America fit into this category. All of these were stimulated by the ideas introduced during the Age of Enlightenment. Down with the divine right of kings. Kings can be questioned. And we'll see when we look at these documents how they were specifically questioned in the US documents, the US Constitution, and particularly in the Declaration of Independence. But look at this. This is a 50-year period of time where you had 4 major revolutions. We sometimes even lose sight of what is a revolution. Well, usually a revolution is not just a coup d'etat or a change in government where one group comes in and changes the government, takes over the government. No, a revolution means there's a complete change of rule and form of rule, government, laws, and so forth. And we know that's what happened with the American Revolution. The British were out, although they provided a pattern. The pattern was changed. No more divine kings. At that time, the king was still pretty powerful in England. French Revolution, again, the king was still pretty powerful. And the king of France and the king of Spain, they were powerful in the Caribbean because these were their colonies. Wars for independence in Latin America. These were complete changes of government. So they're revolutions. That's a lot of revolutions in a relatively short period of time. But this is part of the heritage. We'll see how these ideas were worldwide. Next slide, please. 4 revolutions. Historians claim that the radical ideas of the Enlightenment played a big role in sparking violent armed struggle that brought about independence from colonial rule for new nations across North and South America and the Caribbean, and a complete change of government in a major European colonial power. That's France. All in a span of barely 50 years. So that's North America, South America, including the Caribbean and Central America, and France, one European country. So that was a lot of activity. Next slide, please. How can we compare the apparent transatlantic movement for change with the worldwide protests that erupted after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, USA? Can you identify any aspects or issues of the 4 historical revolutions that distinguish one or more from the others? Can you characterize the role of reparations in the discussion and context of the Haitian Revolution compared to the role of reparations in the discussion and context of social justice for African Americans in the US today? Let's focus on the last one first. Reparations may be a new word to many of us listening, but you're going to hear it. We're going to hear it more and more. Evanston, Illinois was the first municipality to actually pass laws putting through the prototype or beginnings of a form of reparations. Evanston, Illinois. That's something you can look up on the internet or elsewhere. So this is revolutionary in itself because it's such a change. Many claim that this is not something that applies to the U.S. situation, but this is being discussed more and more. But let's look at another situation, Haitian Revolution. After the Haitian Revolution, although the armies and the king no longer, or Napoleon, no longer had direct control over Haiti, the nation of France negotiated with the nations of the world, including the powerful nations, mostly European nations, especially the United States and others, England, that Haiti was going to have to pay reparations for depriving them of their principal colony. And that's exactly what Haiti had to do. It was a very large sum of money, and it took them 150 years to pay that debt. Why were they held responsible? Why did they have to pay it? Down to current generations in the 20th century, who, like many Americans perhaps, were not there when the Haitian Revolution took place. Well, maybe the French didn't have to argue persuasively with historical arguments the way many proponents of reparations for African Americans are trying to argue. They used political force, if not military force, and it was done. The main power tool, so to speak, of the argument for reparations today is to examine history and examine the history of this country and others to see why reparations might be in order, might be an option. Next slide, please. Okay, I think if we have any questions, then we'd like to take a look at those. Otherwise, I can elaborate on some of the earlier points. Solomon, thank you. I was wondering about our own word/language for the middle passage. Thank you for giving us the word ma'afa. It is perfect. Thank you again. And thank you for your comment. I'm not sure if you have your question's already been answered. It sounds like, but that is still debatable. But you've heard part of two different sides of that question, and it's a very interesting argument that continues. It brings us back what you mentioned about education. Carter G. Woodson made some comments about education. The mere imparting of information is not education. The effort must result in making a man think and do for himself. And I'm sure if Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, were writing today, he might change his own language a little bit to be more inclusive, as is the custom through our own level of enlightenment, result in making a man and a woman think and do for him or herself. This is important. He adds, there would be no lynching if it did not start in the classroom. Why not exploit, enslave, or exterminate a class that everybody is taught to regard as inferior? So again, this is pretty revolutionary for 1933. An example he gives for education and geography on how it's treated in many schools. It was then, and sadly, in some schools today, the usual propaganda to engender in whites a race hate of the Negro, and in the Negroes, contempt for themselves. So again, it's always multiple causes. We can't look at one single cause if we're going to look at the total causality, causation. So our history in America involves people of color who are of African descent and other continents, especially now, Asian descent, and people of European descent. And many of us are of mixed descent. And partially because of history, we identify much more with the side of color, because that's the way America's history has required things. Only recently has there been a broader discussion of the biological and cultural definition of race. So one of the things he mentions, Carter G. Woodson, is Tariq as-Sudan. Tariq as-Sudan, the history of the Sudan. He says, our educators didn't know about this book. They left it out completely. A book written in about 1655 by Abdul Rahman Abdul Sa'adi, Ibn Abdul Sa'adi. This was written in Timbuktu about the Songhai Empire. So there were some empires in Africa as well, many, as a matter of fact. West Africa, Central Africa. And so these histories were left out. And so this comes back to self-image. This comes back to humanity. This comes back to depriving someone of language, culture, and history, to deprive them of an identity. So we get our spiritual identity from our legacy, but we as Muslims, first and foremost, from Quran. This is the spiritual identity. This is the relationship with our Creator, and so on and so forth. But we have a larger and a wider identity as individuals related to that identity. I have one final point. If there are no questions, let's see. This is an important point that I'd like to finish up with if we don't have other questions. We talked about the importance of knowing the truth, about doing your own research. We have more resources available to us today than ever before. So we have an explosion of racial science. Many of you have heard of people like scholars like Ibram X. Kendi, Eddie Glaude, many others, whose books have been even on the New York Times bestseller list. In other words, not known only to academics. They're out there. They're on DVD. They're in libraries. People are buying them from Amazon. You can look up many of these on Amazon. Get your own copy in hardback or paperback, depending on the edition. There's been a lot of research, and so we have access to this research. Terms like white supremacy, institutional racism, and reparations are explored in depth. The article we mentioned from the New York Times by Nicole Hannah Jones, What is Owed, that gives the whole history that we're talking about in this course in one article, and also talks about how reparations itself as a concept might come to bear on this history and the changes that we're trying to affect in this country. EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, all over this country, from local libraries to corporations to state and federal agencies. EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is part of the change, the awakening that we're experiencing. This is kind of the enlightenment provoked by the death of George Floyd. Much of this research was going on that I mentioned, the explosion of racial science for the last 5, 10, even 20 years. But a lot of it has been going on within the last 5 years. But only within the last year or two have we had terms like equity, diversity, and inclusion reaching all communities. And so these are terms that the country is grappling with and trying to implement, trying to discuss and decide what should my community be doing to be on the right side of history, so to speak, to promote communication and to promote and implement justice. So systemic racism is being revealed. We have coming up the American Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, Civil War and Emancipation, Reconstruction, and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, then Jim Crow, KKK, separate but equal, lynching, massacres, redlining. This is some of the vocabulary that will help us understand and know in depth this history. People say, well, I didn't know that, or that doesn't affect me, or I didn't benefit from that, or I never did that. Study the history, and then you can have dialogue, no matter which side of the argument you have been on. There is information, there is enlightenment waiting through searching and discovering the history and applying it to today's situation. I look forward to meeting you at this time next week. And until then, I greet you in the words of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.